and everyone. So we have Raymond Mujuni here with us today. Raymond was my classmate, and he became my friend at the diplomatic studies program at the Oxford University. So Raymond is now a LIA Africa Institute Fellow, and he's a very renowned Ugandan journalist and public policy professional, a consultant working with the World Bank. He has interviewed loads of heads of states in Africa, so he's very famous, very knowledgeable and experienced, and please take the most out of this communication with him. Raymond has given us talk at Oxford to our cohort about Africa, and it was great, so I hope you'll enjoy it. Yeah, so we can start, I guess.
All right. Thank you so much. Just confirm for me you can see the screen.
We can see
Great.
it. Yep.
Yeah. And also apologies, I'm on the road. We have a new traffic law, so my network might drop a bit, but I hope that we're able to get through it before it drops. Thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to speak to you. Really big honor first that you're interested in foreign policy and also interested in diplomacy, but also more so diplomacy and foreign policy within the African continent. I think that the African continent is one of the most complex, but also one of the most exciting places to be in terms of foreign policy. Just to start us off, of course, I will give me a minute for general reservations. Let's have this presentation under Chatham House rules, and I presume that we all know what that is, means that we can use the things from this conversation, just that they can't be referenced to the people that have said them. Number two is that I only have one interpretation of Africa. There are many interpretations of Africa as they are African. So every African you might meet might have varied and different interpretation. My interpretation about Africa is my years of experience, reporting on the continent and working on the continent. The other thing is that the more that I have learned about Africa, I've also learned that I don't know enough. So I keep learning new facts about Africa every day. And you must appreciate that this is a continent of 54 different countries. It's the continent with the highest country per capita in the world. So there's always something new to learn. That's just a brief of where I have interviewed, who I have spoken to. And so one of the most defining ideas, the same way you have defining ideas of foreign policy across the world. For example, Europe's defining idea around the fact that sovereign borders and boundaries must exist. Africa too has one defining idea, which is called the Ubuntu idea. The Ubuntu idea is that the other person is a person because you are a person. So it allows for Africans to see the humanity in other Africans across the continent, wherever they find them in the world. And that's a powerful and running idea that you find in at least 46 or 54 African foreign policies. There is the major reference to Ubuntu, either through the use of the word humanity or use of the word Ubuntu itself. And one of the other profound things that's said is that we can't get the world we want unless we develop a central nervous system that allows us to feel each other's pain. So you might see, for example, many Africans get deeply involved in debates around world wars, debates around wars that are not even on the African continent. It's that many Africans understand that just the structural limitations and dangers of war, and they try as much as possible to engage with other parts of the world so that things like war can come to a complete standstill. So you will find, for example, many Africans who are just unhappy with Russia simply because they know what war can do. They know what aggression looks like. And on the continent, for example, more than 30 of the African countries have been at war at least once in the last 30 years. And that's just to show you the experience with war and why many Africans and African elites have this objective philosophy in which they reject ideas like aggression. So let's start with a big picture. I was hoping not to do this. I hope that each of you can identify where Africa is on this world map. It should be very easy. It's this little place in the middle here. Um, it's the biggest geographical landmass in terms of continents of any other continent in the world. It's parceled out into 54 different countries, but they can be 55 depending on where you come from. So there's one other country called the Western Sahel, which is recognized by some African countries, and other African countries do not recognize it yet. But at the moment, there are 54 African countries within the African Union, but 55 African countries if you take countries that have their own self-independence and have declared themselves to be independent from others. So that's just the rider. Of course, it's bordered, as you can see, on all sides by oceans. On one hand, you have the Indian Ocean. On the other hand, you have the Atlantic. And you have, of course, the Red Sea, which flows within that very tiny little loop, but we'll talk about those later. So if you're going to interpret Africa and its foreign policy, if you're going to try and understand Africa, one of the things to understand is just how much geography plays a part in Africa, in its development and its construction of foreign policy. So what is Africa's place in the world? If you know Russia, this is just how much this picture is just to show you how small countries are in relation to Africa. So Russia is a very big country by all estimates, but this is just how small it is in comparison to Africa. The United States is another of huge and humongous countries, but this is just how small it is in relation to Africa. China is another of those countries that people say is very large, 1 billion people, but in relation to Africa, it's a very tiny piece of land. Brazil is another of those countries where you have huge populations, huge land mass, but in relation to Africa, it's again a very tiny land mass. Europe, where many of you guys are, is a very tiny component of Africa in terms of land mass. And India, which is also one of the biggest drivers with a huge population in the world, is also a rather very tiny landmass compared to Africa. So Africa is such a huge landmass and demarcated across 54 different countries that sometimes it's exceptionally difficult to understand, both as a continent and in the way it portrays its foreign policy. So it's easy, for example, to say that countries in Europe are united under the umbrella of Europe and European institutions. Countries in Africa are united politically under the umbrella of the African Union, but many of them belong to different regional economic groupings. And at least all African countries belong to at least two regional economic groupings. So even in terms of unity of purpose, there's very little that you can say identifies the entire African continent with itself. So I get this question many times from people about, was there an Africa before colonialism interfered with it, or before the colonial governments took over Africa? Yes, in truth, there were empires and states long before colonialism interfered with Africa. Colonialism came to Africa in around the 16th, 17th centuries and became entrenched in the 18th century. Before then, we had different imperial systems that were working already in Africa. Some of the longest serving empires, for example, the Ptolemaic Empire, the Egyptian Empire, had been there long before even some states manufactured in Europe. The Ethiopian Empire, which is famously known as the Aksum Empire, had long existed and even had trade relations with the Akkadian Empire and had some trade relations also with some settlements in Europe long before colonialism happened. On the lower half of Africa, this part here, there were Bantu states, and these Bantu states had long existed. They had civilizations of their own, the different ways of organizing. But when colonialism happened, many of them were taken over. So the picture I showed you about Africa is also important because winds play a very important role in Africa. Winds determine agricultural output, they determine settlements in Africa. So, in terms of even figuring out which African countries are most occupied, it always falls down to these winds, the Kuskazi wind and the monsoon winds. The monsoon winds are important because they're the ones that brought what you call Portuguese sailors and introduced Europeans to Africa. The Kuskazi winds are the ones that brought Chinese sailors who are coming all the way from Asia and introduced them to Africa. So those two winds are important because each of the different civilizations that came into contact with Africa because of the different winds that brought them found different settlements. And I'll explain very briefly why. So some of you guys might already know or hear about the exchange happening in the Red Sea. The Red Sea crosses a little bit part of Africa. So this is the Red Sea here, and this is Africa. The Red Sea, the reason the Red Sea is an important trade route is because there's a wind that blows ships, enabling them, even with all the advances in science and technology, shipping as a science or shipping as a trade route is only possible because of the winds that propel the ships. So those ships are often found on the African continent along this Red Sea route. And they are majorly enabled by the monsoon winds. Now, when Europe was heavily indebted, Portuguese sailors set off to try and find new avenues of economic growth. And one of those Portuguese traders was Bartolomeu Diaz, who was one of the first European settlers to come into contact with Africa. And he found these multiple entities, for example, the Egyptian Empire, which had a lot of gold at its disposal, a lot of copper at its disposal, and that in itself led to the first colonial wars that we had. So I've already explained the 14th century discovery of Africa by Bartolomeu Diaz, who was a Portuguese sailor. As he was discovering Africa, of course, there were Chinese sailors who had also set off on their own sail, who later landed on Africa. They weren't exactly Chinese at the time. I guess we can just call them the Asian Empire at the time because it now encompasses parts like India, Indonesia, all of those fell into that empire at that time. So the Bartolomeu Diaz named when he discovered Africa, he named where his ships landed, he named that the Cape of Good Hope. If you ever travel to Africa and come to South Africa, you will find the Cape of Good Hope and you'll find some of the ships which have been preserved from the 14th century there. What also happened is that because of the nature of the winds, that they came only 4 months within the year, it left many of the sailors trapped in Africa, and as a result, forced them to have settlements in Africa. So they had to wait until the next winds would come for them to be able to set sail away from the continent. So part of the things that explains colonialism is that first that they were looking for mineral wealth, but also that they had to form settler communities because they couldn't go back to Europe until the winds had let free. So the Kuskazi wind is very important because it defines the relationship between Africa and the Arab world, what is famously known as the Middle East today. Many people now are recognizing that Africa is getting closer to the Middle East in terms of trade deals, but also in terms of geopolitics, but it has a long historical connotation to it. And that historical connotation is this one, that during the earlier days in the Persian Gulf, sailors formed using the Kuskazi wind and settle in a place called Mombasa. Mombasa is
Raymond, are you saying
on the East
anything?
African.
Yep, Yeah. You just froze for a moment. Yeah, it's fine now.
When you try and understand
It seems like we're having some technical difficulties on the speaker's side, so have to wait a couple of moments until he manages to reconnect to us.
I think he's here. Raymond, can you hear us?
did you last stop hearing me so that I can just...
Yes, I think we stopped hearing you from this slide. Yep. Raymond, are you talking?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, now yes. But probably you'd better start from the start of the slide.
Okay. So I was just saying that the reason that the Middle East and Africa are close to each other is because, one, they share geographical closeness, but also number two, they share so many characteristics and traits in terms of organizations and social organizations. So when you think about the Middle East, which has monarchies, Africa also had organized itself along monarchies. Both civilizations were surplus civilizations from an earlier stage, and both civilizations were engaged in agriculture as the main form of economic productivity from a very earlier civilizational period. These are the much newer insights about Africa that, I mean, you benefit from as a foreign policy expert. The first insight is that 1 in every 2 people that are going to be born between now and 2050 are going to be African. So you have the fastest growing population in the world on the African continent. And it's coming out of countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's coming out of countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And those are within Africa. In terms of an economic insight, is that African economies are indeed growing, but they are all growing averagely at 4%, 5%. And that's nowhere near enough to meet the demands of Africans. So you find in many African countries that there's economic tension between governments and their citizens, simply because the economies are not delivering as fast as they should be doing. This is something that I'm sure you can relate to also as Ukrainians, because you are a huge cereal producing country. The grain cereal yield per acre in Africa has been declining. So it's forced African countries to start importing grain. And that, of course, has made Africa amenable to many things, including to Russian influence, because a lot of grain imports coming to Africa, even though they come from places traditionally like Ukraine, are now governed by Russian businesses and Russian business outlets. The decline in cereal yield and economics has forced African countries to shift towards minerals and mineral wealth. And this is a slide I normally joke I shouldn't be showing to other people because it has the entire mineral wealth of Africa on it. So you'll find there are many deposits of gold that's represented in yellow. There are many deposits of copper, iron, and other ores. Those are represented in red. There are many deposits of diamonds in Africa in the southern belt here. In terms of energy, many of the countries in this oil belt, the black that you see on the map, many of them depend on oil for their basic economics and economies. You have huge gas deposits on the northern coasts of Africa, and that's where the Mozambiques of this world are. And just a small number of African countries now completely depend on agriculture. But also, an even smaller number of Africa has transitioned into industry. So whether that's electric cars, whether that's boats, that's turbines and things like that. So when you talk about the electric revolutions, for example, Africa does not take part in this conversation because we haven't yet taken full participation in the fourth industrial revolution as such. So Africa has since gotten new friends because of the shift to mineral wealth. And one of those new friends is China. In the last 20 years, just by these two maps, you can see the Chinese influence has grown on the African continent. China is one of the biggest export destinations for African goods, but it's also one of the biggest import destinations that Africa gets its goods from. But it's also that Africa is losing a lot to its friends. So this was a study done in 2020 that a lot of the companies operating in Africa were in fact extracting value and wealth from Africa and taking it back to their home countries. So whilst Africa was getting foreign direct investment and foreign aid of up to $62.2 billion, of course, we know that's come down now since the departure of USAID and others. The outflows from that foreign direct investment were at 63.4. The other slide, which shows that Africa is not friends with its friends, is that Africa is still having trouble with trading with high-income countries, and those high-income countries are mostly in Europe. So you can see the United States, for example, is one of the places with the least, as a least import destination for African goods. The European Union is also just above the United States, but nowhere near enough. And then you have Asian countries, and then high-income economies, and of course, most of the goods of Africa come into African countries. So
We can't hear you again.
Mm.
no, just give me a minute. I'm coming. Yeah, so I wanted to speak about trade ties between the European Union and Africa because Africa's relationship is really, Africa's relationship with Ukraine is sometimes tempered by the European Union or members within the European Union bloc. So our trade ties between Europe and Africa are not the very best. They could be better, but they're not the very best. And you can see majority of the African countries really struggle to get markets inside the European Union. There's a huge balance, unfavorable balance of payments position of European goods coming into Africa and less African goods getting into the European market. As a result of this, many African countries, African economies are rebalancing and retilting themselves to find places where they can get markets for their goods. And that's given prominence to Middle Eastern countries. It's also given prominence to China. And it's one of the things that is used largely by Russian disinformation agents to say, Europe doesn't like your product after all, and Ukraine is, of course, striving to be a European country or is a European country, and it's used a lot. So Africa also has a lot of foreign military bases, and these foreign military bases run, of course, France the United States, China, and Russia. But many of those bases sit within what we call the Hippo Belt of Africa, which is this middle part that you see in orange. In foreign policy terms, they give military depth strategic players on the continent. So people with, for example, the United States, which has a huge military base in Djibouti, also has aircraft carriers that are able to survey or surveil most parts of Africa from just Djibouti alone. And it's also created a pathway for trade routes. So China, for example, has taken advantage of its military belt to sort of build this railway that they call the Belt and Road Initiative through this belt. So you might have already seen the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative try and drive railways through this belt. But these military bases are very important in terms of influence on the African continent. They can easily also be converted into political influence. Most of Africa's ports have also since been taken away from the control of Africa. So we have a lot of Chinese investment that's surrounded ports of Africa. We have a lot of Chinese-backed infrastructure around those port areas. And then we've now seen naval bases start to come up on the coast of Africa. And of course, these are mostly Chinese, sometimes China in conjunction with Russia, and in very few cases, the United States and Europe. In terms of Russian influence, I think this is an important slide, of course, for Ukrainians. Russia has this very high returns, low investment strategy in Africa, where it invests, for example, very little in terms of energy, in terms of trade. And you can see the countries that Russia trades with the most: Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. You see where they are in Africa. You can see the countries where Russia has military bases and soldiers fighting. So Nigeria, Central African Republic, Sudan, they have soldiers there. Of course, some of them are Wagner troops that they completely always deny, but we know they're Russian troops. But because of this low investment, they also have this very high returns where they keep speaking about the fact that they are friends of Africa, they are helping Africa fight insecurity. And they keep referring to the fact that, Russia didn't get involved in the colonization of Africa. And of course, very few people call them out on that to say that it was the Soviet Union, and that Soviet Union included Ukraine at the time. So those bullet points always come up in talking points of Russian disinformation agents. To symbolize just how much of Africa has voted with Ukraine since its invasion, this is a good map to show you. So majority African countries have actually voted against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. A lot of African countries have voted to condemn it, but very few African countries have been invested in ending the structural end to the conflict itself. And that's a structural problem because Africa doesn't have influence on the global multilateral stage like the nations. The countries that have been absent from that voting are countries, again, that you will see where Russia has military bases. And the countries that have voted against are also countries that have a very close relationship with Russia, like Eritrea. So a lot of Africa is still, in terms of being favorable to Ukraine and Ukrainians' cause, a lot of Africa is favorable to Ukrainians' cause. A lot of Africa sees Russia's aggression, condemns it, but does not have just the institutional structure and power to do anything about it. So are there any new strategies that Europe and European countries are doing to get Africa back? One, a lot of the European countries are engaging now in investment in green energy. We've seen work around fixing the tax system and the trade system in the world at the United Nations level, at a Comtrade level. There are conversations, but they're not anywhere near finding a solution. The African Union, of course, has voted to have this tax cooperation agreement where companies that invest in Africa then declare their tax returns in Africa so that they can be taxed equitably And that's also sort of helping to temper the relationship between Africa and the West. So I guess I'll stop here and then invite questions if you have any and comments.
Thank you, Raymond, for such an insightful presentation. So please throw your questions at him. He's all yours. So maybe I'll start with the first one. So what would you name as potential ways to get Africa on board when it gets to, conflicts such as the Ukraine, like Russia's war against Ukraine? What can we do? Because obviously, many countries are having ties with Russia and everything, and it's hard to get them on board. But are there any ways to do this?
The quick answer is to increase diplomatic footprint. Ukraine has a very small footprint in Africa in terms of diplomacy. And some of what you'd call the soft power tools of Ukrainian diplomacy, for example, President Zelensky, haven't done enough to court Africa and Africa's leaders. So there's very little work that's done around that. And I think the quick turnaround can be to increase diplomacy with African countries, but also to continue to explain the Ukrainian cause to Africans, because many Africans understand what aggression looks like. Many Africans understand what civil war looks like. Many of them understand just what it means for neighbors to come and impose upon you and take away your sovereignty. So a lot of diplomatic work has not been done. So even the existing effort to push back is largely I think I'm ready for the next question.
Guys, just unmute yourself or hands up, Artem.
Good afternoon. I hope you hear me well. Mr. Raymond, thank you very much for this fascinating, dynamic, interesting, and insightful presentation. It was a pleasure to hear and listen to. And I have two questions. So the first one about the South African self-taken role as an African advocate. Is it the source of consensus, of agreement between African states that South Africa deserves to be a such player, or is there any tension between other prominent African states which leads to rivalry between them? And the second question is about reforms of major financial institutions, which is one of the main key agenda points on future G20 summit and other big forums. So is the major financial institutions in other world is the reason of Africa remaining behind, and their reform is a legitimate aim or cause to be followed to, or it is or the reason of Africa low economic growth is in other dimensions. Thank you.
All right, I'll start with the first question, which is South Africa and South Africa's role in terms of leadership on the African continent. South Africa is Africa's biggest economy to start with. On top of being Africa's biggest economy, it has a lot of tools at its disposal. It has the biggest footprint in terms of diplomatic representation in the world as an African country. It has the largest footprint. Number two is that South Africa has been a traditional opponent of institutionalized systems. So in 1994, of course, I'm sure many of you know that South Africa fought and ended apartheid, which was visited upon them mostly by Western Europe and other countries. So South Africa traditionally has occupied that slot because of, one, the fact that it's Africa's biggest economy. Number two, that it has this large diplomatic footprint. But also number three, that you've had many, what you'd call African icons come from South Africa, like Nelson Mandela, who they completely always draw up on. But there is no consistent messaging from the other African continent that, South Africa is the leader of Africa. Most of the initiatives where, Africa takes a position, those initiatives start at the African Union. And at the African Union level, there are these regional economic blocks, at least 4 of them, which are the most important. We have the SADC, where South Africa is the biggest participating member. We have ECOWAS, where Nigeria is the biggest participating member because it's the biggest economy. You have the East African Community, where Tanzania and Kenya are the biggest participating members because of just the largest of their economies. So those temper the way Africa behaves on the global and international stage. But with regard to the very specific matter of Russia and Ukraine, South Africa has, one, taken leadership to try and mediate between the two. And there was an African Union minute for the African Union to try and find a mediated position. But the reason many African countries do not back it is because South Africa has a very close relationship with Russia. And many African presidents know it. So many African presidents are not comfortable with the South African leadership in that matter. And that might explain why, there is a sort of a little dance of African presidents basically stepping away when South African leadership on that matter comes up. On the second question of reforming institutions, I think that debate is still ongoing. Many African countries are unhappy with the way institutions are run. I think I can share with you many other Chatham House papers which have really explained this issue at large. African countries are unhappy about, for example, the IMF because more than half of African countries are in debt distress right now, and that's because of the IMF. African countries are unhappy about the United Nations because none of the African countries is represented on the UN Security Council as a permanent member, and yet the Security Council makes a lot of decisions on Africa and its security. So there's been attempts at reforming the UN, particularly the Security Council. There's been attempts at reforming these financial institutions. And I wrote my dissertation rather sadly on the reform of those institutions, and I'm happy to share it with you. Yeah. Oh yes, and of course the Russia-Africa summit. Russia captured this moment of debt distress. And at the Russia-African summit, we had, for the first time, Russian leaders calling for Africa to be forgiven of its debt, which is something African leaders had been saying over and over and over and over again. But now, Russia has sort of jumped upon the cause and sort of saying that we are leading the charge for Africa to be a debt-free continent. So maybe that I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat. Anna have found a media on Africa a few years ago. It is called Africa is the Country. I'm not sure if you know it, but the website provides an explanation that Africa is not a continent with 55 countries. And she was wondering what does it mean and what intellectual, political, or cultural discussion stands behind this idea for naming, if you can comment on this. So basically, Anna provided the link to the website. And on the website, it says that Africa is a Country offers a critical perspective on various social, political, and cultural issues affecting Africa that push back on continental legacies of colonialism and exploitation. So my assumption would be that it's about colonial scramble for Africa, but of course, Raymond, I don't want to take your floor, so please. Raymond, are you with us?
Well, yes, I'm aware about the Africa as a country. One of the key defining factors of the African continent is that we are a continent of circumstance. Hi, sorry, are you able to hear me? Sorry, I dropped off.
Your connection breaks a little.
Okay.
Now it's
I was
better.
just saying, yeah, the central organizing theory around the African Union was anti-colonialism. And that is the only reason why people keep referring to Africa as a country. We are a country when we're united in the fight against colonialism. Immediately we finish that fight, we resort to our 54 different states. So you'll also find, for example, many Africans are offended when people refer to Africa as though it's one country. But there's a unity of purpose in the sense of fighting colonialism, in the sense of regaining sovereignty, and in the sense of getting political and economic freedom. I can take a next question.
Yes, maybe I'll just give one more remark, and Raymond will correct me if I'm wrong. But a very important thing about Africa is that borders have been drawn in many ways artificially, mixing ethnic composition of different lands, mixing population of different previously independent states before the colonialism. So that's also influencing how Africa is perceived today and how the country interact nowadays within the continent.
That's a really powerful point. For example, I'm Ugandan. My wife is Rwandan. Rwanda is just to the south of Uganda. And the reason that she's Rwandan is because King Leopold gifted that part of our ethnicity, gifted it to his son, so that the border was drawn based off of flimsy things like, you need a birthday gift, we can draw the line on this level, so without paying attention to the ethnic composition. Yes, I think Yana has a question. I can answer Yana's.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have a meeting with you. Thank you very much for being with us. And I've got two questions. The first one is quite connected with the previous one. As you mentioned, Africa is huge and diverse, and it consists of dozens of different countries. And Ukraine obviously can't manage to engage with all the 54 countries at once. So which ones do you think we should focus on? At first, at least, and why? And the second question is that Ukraine has recently expanded its diplomatic presence in Africa, and including high-level visits and the sort of a few tours of our Minister of Foreign Affairs and new embassies. So have there been any tangible results so far? Because I haven't seen anything about it in our media or any sort of reports, and what could be improved in this strategy if you are aware of any actions related to that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. On the strategy for deploying Ukrainian foreign policy resources on the African continent, I would say because of the nature of the regional economic blocks, you would need an embassy in Nigeria to deal with West Africa. You would need an embassy in South Africa to deal with most of the south of Africa. You would need an embassy in Kenya, Nairobi, to deal with the east of Africa. Those would give you first diplomatic footprint, at least in many African countries. They'd give you a chance to talk to African policymakers and give you a chance to interact with young African ideologues. And they would also give you a chance to give some cultural influence on the African continent. About whether Ukrainian diplomacy has worked on the African continent, I am sad to say not yet, really not yet. A lot of diplomacy that has helped Ukraine on the African continent has come from the European Union, and some of it traditionally came from the United States before they had a change in presidency. So I think there still needs to be a lot more work done in that fact. And maybe to also advise, like, the cultural icons of Ukraine in some parts of Africa might be more prominent, called icons of Ukraine. So you don't, for example, think of a guy like Alexander Zinchenko as a prominent person maybe in Ukraine, but because he plays for Arsenal, which is a football team that's prominent across the African continent, he is capable of transmitting a cultural message far much better than your president would ever do. So that's another thing, to rely on existing Ukrainian cultural icons to do diplomacy for you.
Thank you so much. Tatiana has her hand up.
Hi, my name is Tatiana. Thank you for your lecture. And at least before the war, many students from African countries studied in Ukraine. And my question is, how had the war in Ukraine affected students and maybe immigrants from your country who were living there at the time? Maybe did any of them speak publicly about their experience after returning home, or maybe some of them are still in Ukraine and covering the war, and they have they're popular in your country or not, such posts?
All right. Thank you so much for that question, Tatiana. There's still, I don't think there's a huge African population of students now in Ukraine. Many of them fled immediately the war started. And
You're breaking a little, Raymond.
down on the part of Ukrainian services or whoever it was for the racist incidents that happened around the trains when the fleeing of the war happened.
While Raymond reconnects, I can say that actually this is really a big issue for all people coming from Africa. So my dissertation supervisor in Oxford, she was coming from Africa, a female professor, and that was all she remembered about how the full-scale invasion started, how Africans were mistreated and everything. And I'd say that Russian propaganda had worked a lot on this to blow it up out of proportion, to kind of strengthen this image of Ukrainians as racist and everything. So certain cases did happen, but in each and every case, we should kind of pay attention whether like what were the reasons and what also Ukraine as a state did to protect students and provide conditions for them to leave the country safely. Like at many railway stations, there were like interpreters who helped them understand what's going on. There were buses organized for foreign students, not only for Africans. But unfortunately, in this like information campaigning, we are losing to Russians a lot on it. Raymond, I was just commenting a little bit on what you started to talk about while you were off. Can you hear us now? Lost him again. Яна, у вас ще питання, чи це з минулого разу рука?
Ні, у мене ще уточнююче питання.
Окей, good. Ну, розкажіть щось, поки сидимо, як вам?
Цікаво. Не взагалі. Цікаво зустрічатися з людьми різними. З країн, це Бразилія, Індія. Я навіть знайшла на Ютубі ще ось у нас індуска ж виступала, я її знайшла на Ютубі також. Цікаво.
Sorry, my network has failed.
Yes, we can hear you. So you were saying about racist incidents at the border, and while you were away, I started saying that Russians blew it way out of proportion, and we were not very successful in showing the opposite cases, like how we actually helped the students to get out of the country, and how in many instances people were very kind to all the foreign students. But I don't know, maybe you wanted to add something more to that.
Hello. Sorry, my signal is not the very best at the moment. But yes, there were incidents at the start of the war, and those incidents made it to major news outlets. Now, if you know anything about Russian disinformation, it's that if they can just latch on one major news outlet, they will spread it all the way through. So an image has been created that Ukrainians were racist, even despite the fact that the Ukrainian government intervened and made sure that students boarded the trains and left. But the message of the Ukrainian government intervention hasn't been as prominent as the message that students were stopped from boarding the trains. But that's now being, I mean, it's a long time since it happened, so people are slowly forgetting it, but it's still there. It's something to always keep at the back of your mind when you're speaking to Africans, that moment will always come up.
Thank you.
We have one more question from Yana. So Raymond, if you can hear us, if you can take this one as well.
Sure, that's fine. I'll take that.
Well, I've got two questions again, and the first one is the clarifying question regarding the strategy, like the, let's say, national or state strategy, diplomatic strategy. And as you mentioned, there are like a few main, let's call them players on the African continent, which are China, Russia, United States, and also the European Union. And you said that it's a bad thing that Ukraine is usually, for now, associated with the EU. So we sort of represent ourselves as a part of European Union, which is quite logical because we are integrated in this union. But would you suggest, like, I'm just clarifying, so you would suggest that Ukraine must develop its own state strategy when it comes to African countries, and it would be more productive, let's say, building relations with countries when we represent ourselves as a separate country which is not associated nor with the United States and the European Union, if it's right. And the second question is regarding propaganda, which we also have mentioned a couple of times today. My question is, do people usually in African state, no, let's put it this way, like, where do people in African states usually consume the information from? So is it mostly that they consume Russian propaganda from the internet, or is it from the TV? So they watch Russia Today or whatever, or do they, I don't know, read newspapers? So like, which resources are mostly popular, and if there are any restrictions already, or like measures regarding combat against propaganda? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll deal with the last question first, which is many Africans, of course, consume the information of mobile phones, and mobile phones have mobile internet. And that means the internet is a very powerful source of primary information. And the internet, of course, suffers the fact that misinformation, disinformation is prominent there. But it's also that even on prominent television stations, RT, Russia Today, has now signed multiple deals with many of the broadcasters on the African continent to rebroadcast their content, the material coming out of Russia. On the first one, which is diplomatic strategies and maneuvers, I think on that one, would have to get deeper on small state diplomacy. There are many small states within the EU which still conduct private and personal national diplomacy, but they still revert to the EU. So on broad level thinking, things like overseas development assistance, those can still remain with the EU. But on nationalist sentiment, for example, on convincing African governments about the war and how it should end, I think that has to be at a national level, and you have to be very insistent on it. Like I've told you, in terms of a strategy, if you get Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and maybe Egypt, if you get those 4 countries to sort of conduct diplomacy in them and get them on your favorable side, it's very likely that you can flip more than half of Africa in a very quick succession, because they are major influential economies, they are gateways to ports, but also they are political. A country like South Africa is both a political and cultural influence for Africa. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Any other questions? I think we've run out of questions and we are on time. So many thanks, Raymond, for joining us today. It's really a great pleasure and a great honor to have you with us. Hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. So many thanks. See you next week to the participants, and Raymond, see you around sometime. I don't know.
Thank you so much. I'll see you without a doubt very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay in touch.
Thank you. Have a nice one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Тут проблема єдина, що мені потрібно 12